Welcome and thank you for tuning in. As you may have seen from my more recent uploads, Joe Cornish and I visited our Woodland Sanctuary exhibition and discussed some of our printed work just to offer some insights into our motivations, influences and how we think when photographing woodland. This is the final episode in this series in which we deep dive into 3 more prints from the Sanctuary and A River Runs Through It themes. If you're interested, and all the work that you see is available to order as a print upon request. But thank you for watching and I hope you enjoy it. Another big print, fabulous one from you, Like the First Morning. I always want to burst into song when I read that title. It reminds me of being at church when I was young.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, it was absolutely taken from that hymn or song, and it's actually I associated it with Cat Stevens, who I don't know if you know the artist. It's a little bit before your time. So I was a big fan of Cat Stevens, but he sang that hymn in a very, very beautiful way. And the reason, the title is that this picture was made the first time I went out with serious intent with my camera after the beginning of the pandemic.
Okay.
So I can probably tell you the date, but it would have been in April 2020. And so there was, after all that weeks and weeks of anxiety and feeling kind of trapped at home, that there was a feeling of release and joy and gratitude to be back outside with the camera. I'd gone out really, really early in the morning. It was just an incredible relief. So for me, this picture has very, very positive associations with those memories of that time.
You've used a longer lens on this, a longer focal length, which means that this is fallen out of focus, which really helps just to kind of guide the eye and shift the attention right to the center of the image, where that wonderful morning light is just coming over the horizon there, which we can see, and backlighting those oak leaves, those wonderful springtime oak leaves, which it does have like an autumnal feel to it.
Oh, it's so true. I mean, it's very misleading actually, because you think, wow, really? I mean, but actually, it's amazing how when leaves first appear, they often have a lot of red and yellow in them. I'm not honestly sure why that is, and it depends on the tree and it depends on the year. They're also variable. But yeah, it's odd how early spring can sometimes feel slightly autumnal. Having said that, you can also see in the shadows as greens as well. Yes. And so some of that colour comes from the sunlight itself. Yeah. Just being early morning light, so it's kind of warmer. Yeah. And it's that feeling of the gold, like leaves, little points of gold floating on the air. It's I found it very kind of life affirming. I suppose that's what spring is.
Yeah. And it almost sort of treads the line actually between chaos theory and something that is actually just incredibly, it is complex. There's a lot going on in terms of the tree and branch structures, but I also find it incredibly easy to read, and that's quite a difficult thing to achieve actually. Did you have any concerns like that when you were making the image, or?
Yeah, I did. Well, that's a good question. I think when I was making the image, I was so preoccupied with the moment and the fact that the sun rays were also kind of changing constantly. Yeah, exactly. And essentially, I was, one could always refer back to our conversation about instinct, but this structure of the central oak is critical, and then really just managing the edges, I would say, is what I was thinking of at the time, rather than, what was I thinking about the chaos? Well, yes, it's chaotic, absolutely. I think actually that most of the one thing I will say, and normally we don't talk much about post-production, but there's quite a lot of detail work that was needed in post-production to balance here what you could call the flow of light. Okay. Otherwise, there are parts of it that are quite patchy, where the contrast is too high, had to be subdued a little bit, things like that, exactly. And managed, and that's part of what we do as well. Yeah. So the idea is to try to preserve something that feels very natural and that is still basically faithful. There's lots of chaos in here. I haven't deleted anything, but managing some of the tones, lightening, darkening. Sometimes it's patchy areas, sometimes it's entire branches. You know, just to get the balance of light and to help the background recede a little bit.
Yes.
And what I feel is really a gift in this picture is that there's the light of the sky and there's the darkness of the cliff behind. Mm-hmm. And although, you know, most of the time you and I will be thinking, oh, wanting a dark background, actually here, I think it kind of works. This sort of separation between the dark and the light. Yeah. And there's a kind of symbolism in that as well.
Because there is a lot going on, you know, in some ways there's a sense of kind of claustrophobia about it, but it still equally sits just as well in Sanctuary. And I think the reason why it sits so well in Sanctuary is because the way that you've approached it isn't purely about, you know, a very kind of formulaic view of the woods where you're just trying to create order, where you're trying to avoid, you know, hard lines of contrast. What's actually inspired it is actually being in tune with your emotions at that time. And I felt the same actually when I went out in that spring, was just like, oh my God, you know, just how amazing is it to be back in these places? And that emotion has to drive the work, and that's what I sense here. And it does, it just works. And particularly with the oak trees, which depending upon the time of year and the particular wood, do look quite grey, and which really helps these beautiful flecks of gold, as you put it, to stand out and give it that positive feeling.
It's funny how that's so true, what you just said. I mean, I felt, you know, I always like to think, well, I'll go out with my camera, I should be able to come back with something decent. And you know, usually you can come back with something that's well exposed and well focused and visually coherent. But a lot of the time, unless you have something emotionally that's really driving the sort of intensity of the experience, pictures can be quite bland and just don't really sort of seem to communicate very much at all. I found that recently, for whatever reason, but this occasion was completely different, and I do feel that that when there's that feeling, the feeling of joy and release is, for me, is captured in this image, and that's one of the reasons I love it so much.
And when you feel it like that, that's when instinct takes over, and when you get these magical surprises. Wonderful. Okay, so we've had no order really whatsoever in terms of which theme we've tackled first, but this is actually the first theme in the exhibition, which is a river runs through it. I always let you do the introductions.
I think this is another film reference, isn't it? A river runs through it. Yeah. I forget which film. I know there is a famous film called that, but yeah, clearly there's a. Well, it's something that we both have, you know, the more woodland photography you do, you realise that valleys and rivers, especially in the North York Moors, are a big part of the landscape, and they make a particularly interesting dimension to the woodland landscape to deal with the river itself and the immediate surroundings of the river.
Yeah, it took me a while to discover these beautiful hidden gems that we have in the national park, just tucked away in these valleys, and they might just be very small babbling becks that run through there. These areas seem to have survived felling in the past, and we get these remnants of ancient oak wood. And the fact that there's a river there, that it's damp, we have these steep-sided valleys, it presents lots of photographic opportunities, doesn't it? I mean, we've shown some examples today where we're embracing the sky and those highlights, but actually in terms of bringing out the character and the structure and the wonderful shapes of these oak trees, being able to work against an opposite valley side, which has been created by these rivers, is really fun to work with, isn't it?
It really is, and these are landscapes which are too steep they're much too steep for crops. They're often not grazed. They might be grazed by the odd deer that comes in there, but there might be occasional sheep. But generally, they're very natural. They're very wild. These are really the wildest and least managed parts of the entire park. You think of the top moorland of the park, that's managed for grouse shooting, heather moorland. But these little pockets, these are like little pockets of wilderness, and they may have been coppiced at some point in the past when there was a big demand for charcoal, but now they've been left in many cases for hundreds of years, with very little happening there at all. And so they're delightfully wild and amazing for that reason. And just to reinforce what you were saying, they're great for photography because they're in steep bank sides. It often protects us from seeing the sky beyond, so we're able to work with that darker background.
It's funny because we call this a river runs through it, but the focus is very much on the trees. The river plays, well, in terms of how it's presented in the frame, plays a very small role in the photograph, but actually plays a very important role because that's determined the character of some of these. So because it's damp, dark, sheltered, we get this fantastic growth of moss, of ferns on the tree here, a wonderful rich understory which you just don't find anywhere else in the national park other than the depths of these valleys. The main focus was about this little gathering of these 3 trees, which again needed very precise positioning so that it looked aesthetically pleasing. And we've got some wonderful shapes here in the way they all kind of intertwine and join together with one another. These floating of crispy marcescent oak leaves, little fronds of bracken just to help filling spaces. I love this little green one just pointing up here, which going from the warmth to the cool in the bracken actually just sort of sits very well with just the shimmer of the blue through there. So it's actually, the valley comes down this way. We've got an opening down there which early in the morning there's that strong sense of blue foggy light reflecting off the beck, just filling that space with this sort of naturally dark vignette framing from the wood that surrounds it, and just this very gentle texture in the beck there. The river is a small part, but for me plays a very important part in the overall image.
Also, it gives that dampness, and you've used colour in a way to imply that, but the dampness is evident in the texture of everything here, and it's another thing I wanted to comment on this particular print is the subtlety of the colours. It's very tempting with this type of picture to ramp up the warm colours particularly, to make them zing and pop and so forth. But actually there's a wonderful restraint which gives the colour harmony that this image has. It's just completely immersive and convincing. But what the kind of key for me is this dampness. Is that you feel like you can literally reach in and touch these brackens, and you know they would be damp to the touch. And that's lovely. It's very, very real. And all of the things that you described are important. The arrangement and the very careful positioning of the camera to reveal things in the way that you have. But I think for me, more than that, it's just this lovely feeling of dampness, and I feel like I'm right there when I look at this print.
You can smell it.
Exactly. You also feel like you could slip on that.
This bit actually is quite treacherous. But this is one of my favourite oak trees of this particular woodland in the background here. And it's probably important to say that when I find it, every now and then we walk out and we see a tree, and that's a fantastic tree, and we're just automatically drawn to it. I then sort of treat that tree as a friend, as a project, and it encourages me to spend time with it, explore it from different angles, but not just as a tree in isolation, but how it sits with its neighbours. And that's what encouraged me to have explored this angle before, but it was only on this particular day with this arrangement of bracken and leaves, these conditions, that it worked. And I've looked at it many times since, and it hasn't. So yeah, quite a fortunate moment.
Yeah, it's interesting that how everything sometimes will come together in one particular day. And it's interesting hearing you talk about that, because then I'm finding myself looking and thinking, there's these sort of, the bracken in particular, which appears actually just incidental. And yet, which is great because you haven't had to it appears that you haven't had to manipulate it or change it in any way. But in its incidentalness, in character, it totally suits the scene as it is, and it's chaos, and yet there is organisation, because there's balance. The way that the composition works and is structured, is incredibly carefully seen, and that's big kudos to you for the composition as ever.
Little subtle gestures, small but important. Yeah. Thank you. Good.
Great.
Let's have a little wander down the path here. So this print of yours I think is probably your most recent work in the exhibition as well, is it? Yeah?
It is, yeah.
Yeah? Listen to the pouring rain. Do you want to tell us a bit more about it?
Well, believe it or not, it was shot in June, which will be a surprise, because there's still bluebells, and actually bluebells appear to be at their height. And normally we associate bluebells, especially with climate change being earlier and earlier, in the first 2 weeks of May. But there are these curious pockets that have their own microclimate within the North York Moors where they come later, and this is one of those places. And yeah, it's the story behind it is that I was actually shooting a video at the time. I wasn't shooting it, somebody else was photographing me.
You're doing a lot of these videos now, you must be getting quite used to it.
I'll never get used to it. But anyway, but the funny thing was there were 3 colleagues looking after the filming and the sound and everything. And it started raining, and they all retreated back to the van to get out of the rain. And I stayed.
You were like, brilliant.
I stayed where I was. I had a brolly, and the rain just got heavier and heavier and heavier. And it's funny because we've had this drought summer, but this is the last time I remember really, really intense rain. It was so intense that what you think is the mist in the background is not actually mist at all. It is heavy rain. And if you look carefully at the river, that is rain bouncing off the river. Those big plonking raindrops, which is why it's called Listen to the Pouring Rain. But actually that's also another line from a song. Yeah. So yet another another cultural reference, unfortunately.
No, it's fab. I mean, it does wonders for the colour as well, doesn't it? I mean, you've kept the greens fairly understated, but beautifully natural. Because it's very difficult actually to manage the colour of green and bluebells. But I think the rain has really done it wonders. Kudos to you for braving the elements. Experiences like that, when Mother Nature just wants to batter you with whatever it's got, then those actually are the best times to be out in nature. I always sort of think to appreciate the all kind of nature's colours and shades, you have to experience it at its worst. I remember when I used to be a mountain biker, a blizzard would come and my friend would switch his phone off because he knew I'd be pestering him to go out on a bike ride in a blizzard. Up on the moors like an absolute nutcase. But there's just something special about experiencing all these different elements. And because you're engrossed in experiencing that, then it puts you in tune with actually capturing it as well. But when it comes to the technical execution, you've consciously been aware of the mood and the feeling, the experience that you want to capture, and it's worked perfectly with getting both movement, but also enough shutter speed to capture those extremely quick drops of water in the river as well. Lovely.
I really like the point you made there about experiencing nature in its extremes, and I think that is really true. For anybody who's a nature lover, the idea of bad weather is a kind of misnomer, and it always is frustrating when you watch the weather forecasting girls and boys who I greatly appreciate. They've got a job to do, but I don't want them to give me their value judgments on whether weather is good or bad, because to me all weather is beautiful. The one weather I find difficult, I have to say, is blue sky, unbroken blue sky and sunshine, but that's relatively rare for us. And actually it's that everything that there is we can learn from and experience, and it's absolutely true what you say. It's often at the most extreme that the magic happens. And where for us as photographers, we maybe will do our best work. And although I won't necessarily say this is my very best work, it's certainly a picture I love because I have this intense memory of the sound of the rain on the river and the feeling of that moment, and the intensity of it is ramped up. It's just like a very powerful wind. It can be really, really uncomfortable, but it can be amazing and very exhilarating as well.
Exactly, yeah. And I've just got visions of these other guys sat in the van, you know, in the comfort, probably having a flask of coffee, looking at you thinking, he's crazy. And you're like, this is brilliant. Yeah, but it very much makes me think of the national park as well, just because of the sheep hair. Just little details like that, I think, is quite nice, actually.
Yeah, so characteristic of it, isn't it? And yeah, but it's nice actually in a way to also just say a few words about the park. What a fantastic landscape it is to have on our back doorsteps, because really, I know when I first moved up to this area 30 years ago, I thought it's a lovely area, but it's going to be a struggle to make photographs here, because it's not quote unquote spectacular with a capital S, but actually it's its subtlety. It has definitely a capital S subtlety, this park, and the beauty of it, especially contained in the valleys, is just intense. And the longer I've lived here, the more I've come to appreciate it. I really have.
Yeah.